Hello, my name is Saduki and I am here to talk to you about Azure DevOps. I've done this talk many times for C# developers and database professionals, but today we have a special version for JavaScript. I made sure to create a JavaScript related example so that you can see how can you use this today. So before we get too carried away, let's break it down as to how we're going to talk about this. We'll talk about what is this Azure DevOps tool and why should we as JavaScript developers care? I say we because nowadays I'm actually doing React development. We'll get a quick intro to source control because there are terms that we use in this talk that'll cause all sorts of chaos if you're not familiar with this source control. Then we'll take a look into the Azure DevOps features, and because this is being delivered in an online fashion, we're going to go directly into Azure DevOps at this point. I have slides, but the slides are more for when I have to deliver this talk, be it asynchronously, or maybe I'm at a user group and I don't have online access. Plenty of screenshots to talk to. But rather than talking to the slides, let's go ahead and see it in action. And we'll get to see the demo in action as well. The demo is a Create React app based application that is running in Windows Azure. I say Windows specifically because I have an app service in Azure that is set up as a Windows environment running Node 12 LTS. After all of our demo and exploration, then we'll take a look at some additional resources. These slides will be made available after the conference, so you'll have access to these links as well. So Azure DevOps, what's this about? Well, being a Microsoft product, you have to realize there's that formerly known as. Because Microsoft products, they change their names. So Azure DevOps used to be known as VSTS, or Visual Studio Team Services. And some of the features that you're going to see from the Team Foundation Server family. So we'll take a look and see some elements of TFS that happen to be in there, as well as some other features. The high-level overview, what do we get out of Azure DevOps? Continuous integration and continuous delivery. We can actually automate that with pipelines. What this means is that you can write your code. You can write your Create React app right on your machine. You can say, okay, I've got my code here. I'm going to push it up to the server. I'm going to make sure my teammates are good with me bringing the code in. Once they're fine with my code going into our branch or whatever we're going into for our environment, get their approvals, code's going to build on the server, then it's going to deploy to Azure. We will automate the whole thing in this talk. Rest assured, these steps have already been made, so we'll be looking at created steps, but we do go through that whole process. You'll see that we'll break our project up into various different work items, and they're used as epics. Epics are like the big features. The features themselves break the epic into smaller manageable chunks. We'll look at tasks and bugs and other manageable chunks as well. Azure DevOps, you can track your work against the chunks. So when you have that project manager come to you and say, hey, you know that task that you said you're working on during stand-up? Can you take a look at that? And by the way, can you remind me where are you at? You can say, project manager, go to the card and you can see that I just pushed some code over to the server. Give it about 10-15 minutes to deploy to our server, and then you can go ahead and check out that functionality yourself. I've had this conversation with our project managers before. Azure DevOps allows us to store versions of our code in source control using Git. So, tracking code against work items. I can't really stress how important that is, because I've had so many conversations in my career with project managers always asking, where are you and what kind of work is being done? I can just go back and say, go look at the work item in Azure DevOps. You can do code review and change tracking through source control. So the code review allows you to review your teammates' code going into your working branch, and you can go, you know that line of code there? You know how you have multiple ifs? You can condense it down to a switch. Or you know how you have a for loop and you're creating all of these different list items? You can just condense this down into a map. So you can leave that kind of feedback on their code. Change tracking allows you to go, okay, this is broken, but I don't know why. And you can look at the changes and you can see, okay, who changed this file? What was the reason why this is broken? Oh, yeah, Sudoku broke it again. We better go find Sudoku to see if she can explain what's going on and how we can get her to fix it. So change tracking allows you to see who changed something and when. The code review allows you to say, hold on, your code's really not up to par. You could also say, okay, no, your code is good. We'll take a look at that as well. Again, you can automate the build and deployment processes. As developers, it's very easy for us to be in companies that are like, okay, we need you to work on 50 things all at once, and oh, by the way, you need to be able to deploy those as well. Sometimes you don't have time to focus on your code and your deployments and everything else. Automation will help take off some of that stress. Once you have builds and deployments that are smooth, you get back a lot more time that you can be focusing on code, styling, JavaScript stuff, whatever you're working on. You can even automate things such as Webpack and linting. Now, as I mentioned, Git is the source control that is used in Azure DevOps. So why do we even need to use source control? It goes back to the change tracking. Who made that change and when? The accountability. Who made that change and when? Okay, hey Sarah, you know that change you made a couple weeks ago? Yeah. In this particular file? No. I've done a lot in the past 2 weeks. So then I can go back and go, oh yeah, look, there is my name. There's when I did it. Oh yeah, this code. You're held accountable because there's your name on it and when you did it. But you can also go back into change tracking and see what you changed. Versioning, so you can actually store different versions. You can tag your code in different versions. That code review function, so you can say, hey, my teammate is getting used to the code. It looks like it's in a good format. Let's bring it in. Or you can say, you know, you've got this ridiculous loop that can be condensed into something smaller with an arrow function. Let's talk about that. You can leave that feedback there. Constructive criticism, by the way, goes a long way. Take a friendly approach. Remind people it's about the code, not about the person. It's all good. Now, some folks aren't familiar with going into source control, so let's get some basic terms out of the way. A repository is a collection of code that's related and stored together. A branch is your line of development. So you could be working in a development environment, a staging environment, a production environment. You could be running something locally. Maybe you're working on a brand new feature, so you have your own feature branch. A line of development is basically, I'm working on something or something needs to go somewhere. We'll talk more about branches when we get to the demo. Clone, okay. So the repository lives on the server. It lives in Azure DevOps in the Git repository. Clone is saying, I want a copy of that repository on my machine so I can make changes locally. Pulling is, let's get any changes from the server. My demo is a single developer. However, my work environment in the past and currently is there are multiple developers. Somebody could make a change and push it, and I need to make sure that the code I'm working on has the latest changes, so I need to pull the changes from the server into my clone, into my copy on my machine. When I'm ready to put my changes live, I'm going to push them to the server. Now, before I can push it, I need to commit and say, hey, this set of code that I'm working on, I need to save it. And I need to then, before I push it, I just want to commit it. I want to say, okay, I wrote this code, and this is what this code represents. Now, some folks I've worked with have been to the point where they're like, well, I'm not going to commit any of my code until my feature's done. Okay, fine. Maybe they have a small feature. I could see that happening. Maybe you have a large feature, as I'm almost notoriously known for. I get the large features that end up getting carried for months. So I always am keeping my branch in sync with our main branch. 'Tis the joys of being a senior developer, right? So this is what we do. But that commit for me, I don't do the when my feature is done because I'm carrying a branch probably for months. If I didn't commit 3 months of work and then I lose something on my machine, that's on me. So I treat commits as save points. I'm a video gamer, and playing long games, you have a save point. This is my save point in code. I also have the commits that I call the hit by a bus commit. So at the end of the day, I commit everything in, regardless of what I'm working on and where I'm at. And if it's broken, I make a note in my commit message, hey, this is broken code, but I'm going to commit this now in case I get hit by a bus. Now, granted, we're in a pandemic right now, and commuting is not a thing that I have to worry about. However, at the end of the day, when I shut down from work and spend time with my family, if I don't wake up the next morning for some reason, if I feel sick, my teammates can pick up my work and go. So I do that hit by a bus commit in case something does happen, my teammates aren't stranded. Alright, so we have a sample repository. In the sample repository, I use the Create React App template to make life a lot easier. We'll have branches, so my branches are going to show the different features that I'm working on. So building an event list, building an API for the event list, building a vendor list API. So things like that are what I'm working on as my features. Then you'll also see that I have a dev branch and a main branch. So maybe I have a development environment and a production environment. I could keep those managed with dev and main. Don't panic with the word failed there. So when I first did this demo, it was set up with a different set of code, and I had a broken build. That has since changed, and I don't use my dev branch. So if you're wondering why that is, that's what's going on there. Now for you might use branches differently. So I'm going to give you some examples of branches that you might be seeing in the wild. You may see feature branches, which is I've got a feature for my application, and I need to focus on that feature. So you create a branch on your machine, work on the feature. It isolates you from working in production directly. So, or your dev environment or your staging environment or any other environment. You can also separate features into their own branches. So hence why I have a vendor list API, an events list API, and the events listing are 3 different feature branches. Release branches are those that are waiting to be deployed to production. They could just be called release. They could be called release with a version perhaps. Maybe that's called master or main. It all depends on the company you're working for and what they prefer. Hotfix branches are when that bug happens and production goes kaboom. And you gotta fix production. Inevitably, these typically happen Friday afternoon, about 4 o'clock, and by the way, you know how you're planning on going out with friends right after work? This bug has to get addressed first. So hotfix branches are there to... You'd create them if you're fixing something in production. Just create it off of the production branch, fix it, and worry about moving it down later. Now, the initial flow of Git in general. You can either create the repository locally and then add all the Git setup and then push to the server. Or the way I like to prefer to start for this because of ease of use is create the repository and then clone it locally. Write the code locally. Add those changes to a staged change set. So let's say maybe you're working on multiple things at once and you're like, okay, I want to commit these files. These files here have the styling. These files here have the layout. And this file here is the test. So you can maybe say, I want to just commit my tests right now. Tests are looking good. The website itself needs more styling, doesn't look so good. So you can group it like that, for example. Committing the changes, again, that's that save point. I want to save these files that I put in the stage change set. And committing the changes, you add a message to say, this is what these files are used for. And then push the changes. Send them up to the server. Now the flow going forward, once that repo is created, pull the latest changes. Make sure that you have the changes for your branch you're working on and for the branch that your branch is based off of. So in my demo, my main branch is actually called main. And then my feature branches are based off of main. So main is I am going to be going into Azure branch, or I'm already in Azure, and then creating a branch off of that. I'm going to make more changes on my machine. I'm going to stage those changes. I'm going to commit and save those changes. I'm going to push the changes up to the server. And then I wait. No, not really. After I push the changes to the server, then I need to go into Azure DevOps and create a pull request. A pull request allows me to say, I have code in my feature branch that I want to put into my main branch. So could you pull my feature branch into the main branch? The pull request is saying, I want to take code from one branch and pull it into this other branch. This happens when, for example, you don't have permission to write to production directly, but you have code that really needs to go to production, you do a pull request. If you can't push directly to the branch, again, this is where this is really needed. In Azure DevOps, you can set these for approvals. You can set this to rely on builds. You can this relying on passing tests or various other gates. So here's a sample. This is a sample pull request that you're seeing over here. What you're seeing is that there are 1 of 3 reviewers approved, so I needed 3 other people besides myself to approve this. You can say that the person who submitted the pull request can approve it or not. In my demo, it is set that I can because this is a team of 1. Work items linked. This is one of those that they have to have something on the board. If they don't have anything on the board, then they need to go create the work item and then link it. Comments. So if you add a comment to a pull request, those need to be resolved. An example of that would be, like, let's say I have code out there. Again, we'll go to the for loop that's multiple lines that can be reduced to something such as a map. Then let's say my coworker is looking at my code and says, hey Sarah, you know that really long for loop? You can reduce it to a map. See this link for more details. They could put that in the comments. Then I could go, oh, that's so cool that I could use map to reduce my for loop from multiple lines into something much shorter. I like these arrow functions. Okay, write the code, commit it, leave a note for your coworker, hey, I updated it using map, and you can resolve the comment. So the comments need to be resolved or addressed. You can tie this to a build pipeline and say, by the way, my code has to build in order to be pulled in. You can also do things like check tests. Make sure you have certain test coverage points. Make sure that your tests are succeeding. That can get tied in the build. So various things we can do there. Okay, features of Azure DevOps. As I mentioned earlier, I have slides for all of these, but because we're in an online world right now, let's actually go look at this directly in Azure DevOps. So we're going to switch over to our Azure DevOps. Over here. Okay, so we have Azure DevOps open. It's dev.azure.com. Now, some background. So I have a Azure DevOps account, a subscription with Azure DevOps. I also have an app service that's running Windows with the Node 12 LTS runtime. I will probably mention that multiple times throughout this talk just to remind you of how my setup is. So we're going to take a look at what we're looking at right now is this dashboard. And you can see that I have one project. I have possibilities. You could have other projects in here as well. And they would all show with this kind of setup where it's a block with the project title, a project description, and then links to the various different sections. Okay, so we're going to take a look first at possibilities, the project. Okay, so about this project, you can see that it's got JavaScript, it's got some CSS, it's got some HTML. What else can you see going on here? So this is the overview. This is the summary specifically. So what you see with the summary, the description for it, the languages for it, if you like it, but you also see the project stats. The project stats are important because you see things such as how many work items are created and how many have been completed. You can see how many repos are there. You see the number of pull requests open, the number of comments. Then you can also see the success of the build and release pipelines. You'll see the build succeeded, deployment succeeded. Yes, my builds are at 40%, my deployments are at 86%. This is what happens when you're setting up a new project with a CI and CD not working as anticipated, as you shall see. So, this is the summary in the overview section. Dashboards allows you to get better overviews of your metrics. You'd have to configure those. I don't have any set up in here, so we're not going to take a look at that. The analytics views is another thing for keeping track of metrics. With the asterisk, it's usually a preview feature, so we're not going to take a look at that. A wiki, again, you can keep track of various notes about your project, things you want to store in there, but we're not going to cover that either. Let's take a look at the next section, though, which is boards. So the board section, this is where we talk about the work items that I had mentioned. The epics and the features and everything underneath. So we have a vendor listing, a recipe tracking, a calendar of events. So this website about pawpaws, I eventually want to track things like where are the various festivals for pawpaws. For example, usually in September in Athens, Ohio is the Ohio Pawpaw Fest, which has been going on for a long time. So this is something I'd want to include on there. For vendors, I want to keep track of the vendors and maybe later on have an entry page for them. So some of the vendors you'll see here include Integration Acres, who's huge in the pawpaw community. You'll also see Neo Pawpaws, which is a website that my husband has started for keeping track of the pawpaws and our discoveries so far. So I break it down to the big things of what I'd love to see. And then from there I can go, okay, so my vendor listing. This is my epic. And I can say, okay, related work, vendor display, vendor entry page. I'm going to add another existing item since I've added more items since then. And I'm going to do a search for vendor. And I should probably have the vendor's API tied to this. So I'm going to say this is a child. And I want to go ahead and save this. So from an this is actually a feature level. The epic is one step higher. So you can keep track of the various levels of your work items. Go back to the work items page. You can see then if I go into the vendor's API, that it is linked to a parent, a vendor listing. Then there's a child for creating a mock API, so I can track work against that if I wish. So the work items, what this allows us to do, this allows us to say, okay, I have a need for doing something. This particular thing is a product backlog item. How do I know? Because right above here, it says product backlog item and its number. The number is 297. This also shows that it's unassigned. But I could say, hey, Sarah, you can set to work on this. If I had multiple devs on this project, then I could choose multiple devs here. I can commit this to a sprint, and I can say, you know what, this is not going to go in this sprint. This will go in sprint 2. And save it. Priority-wise, say it's 1, 2, 3, or 4. There's no heavy priority on it. I'm going to leave it as is. And the effort to create a vendor's API, I'm going to say is 5. And this is just a Fibonacci estimate guess. And save that. So you can do all of that kind of tracking here. You can do sprint planning. I don't have that set up in here, but there is the ability to do sprints and looking at the velocity of the team. You can keep track of time off. We've done that in the past, in my past experiences as well. Now, there's a board section under the board section. Microsoft, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of developers there. And what do we developers struggle with? Naming things. So you're going to see some names getting repeated. Boards under boards being the first one we've encountered. This way you can see what's new. If you have an approval process, you can do an approved, committed, and done. You'll see that something was recently in there in the done. Backlogs, what are the things we have to work on that don't appear there? Sprints, again, you could do the whole sprint planning process through here. You've got the backlog. You've got the capacity. So if I have multiple devs, this is where you come in and say, okay, this is the capacity per day. You can break it down into, you know what, deployment. I can do this for one. I'm going to, oops, not add a user. I'm going to go ahead and save that. I click under here, I can add another activity, and then I could say that development capacity per day, I might be able to do that for 6 hours a day if I don't have a lot of meetings, and save it. So you can do this for each of your devs, and then you could say, you know, I'm going to come in here and say that I have a day off coming up. I'm going to be off on August 14th because I have this awesome conference I'm going to, and tell it okay. So you can keep track of all of your stuff under the sprint section for doing your sprint planning. And then, like I said, later on you could take a look at your velocity and see the various charts and the analytics for that. Okay, let's take a look at the next thing, which is queries. Queries allows us to filter through our various work items and seeing what's out there. I don't have any favorite queries, so this is why the screen appears blank. I'm going to go ahead and say I have a new query. And I want to see everything that is not equal to, so let's change this from equal to not equal. The less than greater than symbol is a not equal. Not equal to new. So anything that's not new, I'm going to go ahead and run it. And you can see that I have various different work items that are not in the new state. So we've got some stuff that's done. We have stuff that's committed. Stuff that's in a to-do state. So we have some various states that we get to look at things. So this allows us to see, okay, which tasks are in what state, what's been done. Now, before I get too carried away and leave the work items section, I wanted to point out something else. So I have another tab open in here in this browser called React App. That's pretty generic. Oh, it's the possibilities demo. This is exactly why we're in here. Let's fix that title name. So I'm going to file a bug. So I'm going to come back into Azure DevOps and I'm going to create a work item. So I'm going to go under work items. Yeah, I'm going to be fine leaving my query behind. I'm going to create a new work item. This is a bug. And I'm going to call this need updated title for React App. And I can specify which sprint. I'm going to send it to sprint 2. Open the app in a browser and notice the title shows React App. That's kind of a generic thing. Let's fix it. Acceptance criteria. This is a habit I like to get into, and this is title no longer shows. Oh, I can't type longer. No longer shows React App. And then here we can say, all right, how severe is this? This really isn't a medium. This is a low priority kind of deal. Don't like estimating things less than 1. It's what a team I've worked with in the past has set. So we'll go with that logic. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. So now I have a bug, 302. Let's go update that. In order to update that, we're going to take a look. Instead of doing the whole cloning locally, we're just going to work within the Azure DevOps environment. So I'm going to go to repos. This is where our files are. Now, to change that title, I actually need to get into the public files. If I go to Pawpaws app, if I go into my public file, I go to my index.html, you'll see that it shows on line 27 React App for the title. So we need to fix that. So I'm going to edit this right in the browser. And instead of React App, I'm going to have it say Pawpaws abilities. And I'm going to commit this change. Committing, like I said, is that save point. Now, on their screen in the browser, I need to say that I want to commit this. And I'm not going to link this to a work item. I want to show you how I do this in the comments. So I'm going to say updating the title. And this was 302. And I can't commit to main directly. So this is going to be called fixing app title. And I'm going to tell it to commit. Alright, so it's committed. How do I know? Because it says here that it's committed, and it's number 302. Hey, I changed code. I should do what's called create a pull request. So let's do that. Remember, I want to pull this code from my local branch into the main branch. I'm going to say updating the title to 302. And notice that it automatically linked bug 302. So in your commit message, if you include the number sign plus the number of the item you're working on, it'll automatically do that link for you. Kind of handy. I'm going to go ahead and create the pull request. Alright, now the way my pull requests are set up for my demo, I have a couple things. So let's take a look at here where it says view all 2 checks. First of all, it has to have a work item assigned to it. If I don't have a work item, I need to go create the work item. In this case, we created the work item first. We filed the bug number 302. And I remembered 302 for the short period of time I needed it for the commit message. But you saw on the web interface that it actually has that drop down. But when you're running locally, you don't necessarily have that drop down. So, and then the other thing is the comments must be resolved. What does that mean? Let's take a look. So I could take a look at this and be like, that for loop can be simplified as a map. So this is the example I was talking about earlier. Or if you have a really long for loop and you want to simplify it. And then I can go, okay, update the code, push an update. And I can come in here and be like, I updated the code. Please let me know. And I can say the reply. And then my coworker might come in and say, hey, you know what? This looks good. And then reply and resolve. And it says comments must be resolved. And now it shows, because I resolved it, that we're good. I still can't pull in the pull request. I can't pull the code into main because I need somebody to approve it. Now, this particular one, I have it set up so that I'm allowed to approve my own code because I'm the only person on this project. Now, you could be one of those developers who has 50 different things going on all at once and you don't have time to keep coming back to check your pull requests. That's what autocomplete is for. You can click on Set Autocomplete. You can specify what kind of merge you want. I have a lot of rules in place to prevent me from doing anything I don't want to mess with. You can say complete the work item, so if you're working on something and you're not completely done, uncheck that checkbox. But if you are completely done with the feature you're working on, then go ahead and check it and say, you know what, you can complete this. Also, deleting the branch after you're merging. If you don't need the branch anymore, get rid of it, clean it up. I'm going to set autocomplete. You can also customize the complete message. And then I'm going to go ahead and approve my own PR. Notice it says delete source branch. And it should show closed. It's not refreshing like it should. If I refresh this, you'll see that it is completed. It says completed the pull request. And then it usually will show a close button. So don't panic if you don't see the close button. As long as you see the green check mark, you know that it's good. Okay, so now that the pull request is there, I said you can let this code into main. What's next? Let's talk about CI/CD. So let's take a look at this pipeline section. So pipelines, this is where the CI/CD, where the action happens. Did I mention Microsoft is great at naming things? There's a pipeline section under their pipeline section. What? So this little pipelines under the big pipeline section used to be called builds. But one day I was working and I came in and I saw they renamed it to pipelines. I was not too happy because pipelines under pipelines is just as confusing as boards under boards. Again, naming is hard, so we sympathize, but doesn't make it any less confusing. The pipelines, the little pipelines underneath the big pipelines, that's also what we used to know as builds. This is what will take your code and it'll do whatever you tell it to do. So for my build, I'm going to go ahead and click on the pipeline name, pawpaws-1-ci. I'm going to come up to the upper right corner and click Edit. Why am I going to click Edit? So we can actually look at the steps. Okay, so we're looking at this pipeline. I can rename it, but I'm going to leave it to the name that it was created with. I've got an agent pool of Azure pipelines. I have a specification of my Windows agent. So I'm running a Windows 2016 agent with Visual Studio 2017. That was just automatically assigned. Because I'm in a build, we want to see what is this listening to. And this is actually listening to the main branch for possibilities. And what it's going to do is when it sees that there's changes on there, it's going to trigger this part of it, which is the build. For my build, so I've got to run on an agent. So this is running in Azure, and it's going to run over, I have just all default settings right now, nothing special. I'm going to tell it what version of Node I'm running. I'm running 12x. Again, I'm running a Windows app service with the Node 12 LTS runtime. I'm going to run npm install, get all my dependencies. I'm going to run it specifically for my app, which is in a Pawpaws app folder. I'm going to tell it to run install. Yes, I really do want it to force. Then I'm also going to run a npm run build, so I can build my application, do this on the build step, rather than trying to deploy all the code and build it on the server. Don't do that. Do the build first. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take what it builds, I'm going to push that into what they call it's going to be pushing as an artifact. On the left hand side there's an artifact section. The artifact section is typically used for like custom npm repositories, for example, on the JavaScript side. And then there's the publish artifact, which goes to the artifact feed, and it's going to store the output of the build. So we're going to just say build this, or we're going to say first get the dependencies, build it, and then push the build into the artifact state. So let's go ahead and go back. And you'll see that the latest thing, the updating the title, it looks like it was successful, and it took 3 minutes and 28 seconds. Let's see what actually went on in there. So if I click in there, you can see which repository it's running. You can see when did it start, how long did it take, which branch is it running, what's the hash set. You can see any work items tied to this. You can see the artifact that got published. So if you're not sure what it's building and then storing as an artifact, you can click on published. I can come in here and see that in my drop folder, I actually have the build output. Sometimes if you're in the C# world, it puts a zip folder. You can download that and ensure that whatever it was building is exactly what you're expecting. And then there's test and coverage. I don't have any tests for this example, so we're going to skip past that. So this is the build. That's the continuous integration. The next is the continuous deployment. So instead of calling them deployments, they're called releases. So we're going to click on releases. And we'll see that there's a deployment to production that was succeeded. I'm going to click on that. Let's take a look and see what the details show. So the details show everything succeeded. I was able to initialize the job, so the agent can run the deployment. It downloads the artifact, the thing that we just saw on the build. This is what it's downloading. It's going to deploy this to the Azure App Service. Again, Windows App Service that's running Node 12 LTS for the runtime. So we have all sorts of things going on in there. And then it should be done. So now if I come over to my Possibilities app and refresh it, Now the title no longer says React App. So now you see my demo. If you're curious, I have a vendor list, I have a home. The home page doesn't have much under here. So this is just a simple starting point for a Create React App. But I was able to make those changes. I made those changes in repos in the files section. You can see what I did if you go to the commits. And this merged, that means that I'm bringing my code in from my feature branch into the main branch. And you can see what changed from React App to possibilities. Commits are great for showing that. It's great for showing who did it and when did they do it. If I hover over it, you can see the when. Pushes, you can see if I'm pushing to the server, what kind of things I'm doing. Again, branches, those are the features I'm working on. Tags you can do, these are similar to using tags in like a GitHub or a GitLab repo. And my pull requests, again, pipelines, you got to see how we deploy this stuff as well. Some other sections or other features in here. Under pipelines, there's environments. So if you have a particular environment you want to deploy to, you can. This supports typically virtual machines and other things. So if we go new environment, you can see I can support other resources. I can support Kubernetes. I can support virtual machines as well. If you want to see what these look like, if I go to Pawpaws and click on there, you can see what was deployed to the Pawpaws website. I guess let's go back to commits so you can see the story of what's going on there. So if we look at commits, well, trying to set up the CI/CD, you can see things like please work, and maybe this works. Initially, I was hoping to show you this demo on a Linux virtual machine, but it decided not to cooperate nicely with this. So I ended up falling back onto a link that showed me how to walk through a Windows virtual machine. So, or not virtual machine, a Windows app service instead of a Linux one. So you can see all sorts of things in my commits. So pipelines, the environments, you have environments that also no longer exist. Releases, again, these are the deployments to whichever environment you're deploying to. You can have multiple stages too. So my demo only is production. In my last environment that I worked in, my last employer, we had a dev environment, a staging environment, and a production environment. So we had different stages for those different environments. It helps to say, I want to deploy this to our development site. And then you could say, this release, it looks good in development. Let's deploy that particular release into our QA environment. QA signs off on it. Okay, that QA release, let's deploy that over to our production environment. We have another section that's now called library, and this is for variable groups. Variable groups are helpful if you're doing deployments where you want to include variable values such as a server name, for example. Task groups are used for sharing steps between builds or sharing steps between deployments. Deployment groups, this is if you need to deploy to multiple machines. For example, if you're deploying to things that are going to maybe to your Azure instance and maybe you have an on-prem instance for some reason. So you could set up parallel environments that way. Test plans. So I don't have any test plans in here that I know of. I don't think I do. The thing I liked about test plans, we used them in the last place I worked, is that you could have a test plan. You can say, run the website, check to make sure the title shows this. And then there's a browser plugin that you can use to see, okay, does this work? Yes, check. Does this title match? No, it doesn't. X. Fail the test. And then whoever's running the testing team can see, oh yeah, this test was run and it failed. And you can trigger all sorts of other workflows, such as, oh, it failed, let's file a bug. Something like that. So test plans are good for manual testing. And like I said, there's a browser plugin that you can use to do that. Unfortunately, the problem with this particular test plans thing is that you can't use this on free accounts, and you really need the enterprise licensing in order to get there. It's expensive. So test plans, this again is for more of the manual testing, not the automated tests like NUnit, JUnit, Jest, stuff like that. Those are actually done through the pipelines. So then artifacts. Artifacts can be used for custom NPM packages, but I don't have that set up here for now because going through that demo would take a whole different amount of time. So rather than going through that demo, I just want to acknowledge that this is what that could be used for. Okay, we've looked at the various sections for Azure DevOps. Let's go back to the slides. So we took a tour of Azure DevOps live, and we did the demo as well. There are the various groups, and you can see here that we have the overview, the boards, the repos, the pipelines, the test plans, and the artifacts. It does include a wiki, however, we don't have a wiki set up. And yes, this screenshot shows that build succeeded at 92% and deployment succeeded at 92%, but that was for another run, not for the current state. For the boards, there are various different sections in there. If you have it set up to do sprint planning, you'll also see some other things depending on your license for Azure DevOps. You may also see sections like activity feed, the calendar, the product vision, the estimates. So the work items you saw, there's the Agile process, which is epics and features, user stories, tasks, and issues with bugs, and you can assign tasks to bugs. So this is that pattern. What you saw on mine is the Scrum process, which is still epic and feature, but then there's product backlog item and task with bug and task. Issue trackings are impediments, but we don't actually show that in our demo. If you have a more formal process, then CMMI, which is the Capability Maturity Model Integration, perhaps this is something for you to explore. So these, when you set up your project in Azure DevOps for the first time, these are some of the things you need to decide, which is like your work item process. For the work items, you can see the various different types in action. This particular example is for doing database DevOps. So the talk I do for database developers and actually automating their databases and deploying those to SQL. The repo section has the files, the commits, the pushes, the branches, the tags, the pull requests. The commits, again, the commits I stress because you can see how did these things get into our main line. The sample commit, you can see when I created the vendor display list that I passed over the navigation, the vendor list, all of my change files are what you're seeing over on the left-hand side. And I just happened to get a screenshot of some of the ones that I added. So pipelines, there's pipelines which are the artists formerly known as builds. There are environments, which I didn't really cover in the demo. There are releases, which are what's getting deployed. Those are your deployments. Again, libraries for shared variable groups, task groups, and deployment groups. Didn't get into those too much. Pipelines versus releases. So the terms are very confusing because they're in the big pipeline section. Think of it as builds versus releases. In your builds or your pipelines, that's where you're going to do the run the linter. That's where you're going to do the run the tests. This is where you're going to check to see if the linter fails, stop right there. If the tests fail, stop right there. Don't even deploy this. Just fail the build. The red build failure is good enough of a trigger for devs to go, okay, we got to fix this. File the bugs or do whatever your process is. But the pipelines, the builds, that's where you're going to build the sites. This is where you're going to change scripts and get stuff ready to get deployed. The releases are the actual deployment itself. You can trigger the releases based off of the pipelines. In our demo, we have it triggered off of the main. So our builds are triggered off of changes to the main branch. And then our deployments are actually triggered off of that as well. You know what? I want to show that. So let's show that. Let's go back to Azure DevOps real quick. So if we go to pipelines, and we go to releases, I'm going to click on edit so you guys can see, so you all can see. I apologize, still adjusting that. So this person with a check mark, if we click on that, you can see we have continuous deployment triggered, and it's going to look for any changes to main, and that's going to then trigger the deployment. You can also add things in here, so I could say add and change any other branches in there as well. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. Now there are also these person icons here. This is where you can add other filters, other triggers, you can add approvals, things like that. So releases, you can set all sorts of gates on it. Let's go back to our presentation. Again, environments allows you to manage various environments, including virtual machines and Kubernetes, and additional resources as well. Deployment groups are used for parallel deployments. Test plans, again, needs the enterprise licensing to work. Artifacts, this is for if you have custom NPM packages. The time to show that takes a bit longer than what we have allotted, so I've included a link for you on how you can handle that. We did our demo of the Create React app and how we were making changes to it. Again, I have a Windows app service with the Node 12 LTS runtime running. That way you could see how that works. My build pipeline, also known as just a pipeline, I tell it which version of Node I'm running, npm install, npm run build. Then I publish the build over so that we can use that in the deployment. For the release, I grab the artifact from the build, and our demo only uses one stage of production, but you were able to see that work. Broke down and we took a look at the details. When you do the build, it's going to structure this in the app service, so it's within www root. There's going to be some files to watch out for, the manifest.json, and there's a pre-cache manifest that talks about the file layout for the static folder. The static folder is, that's where most of the things appear. Now, some final words of advice. Build often. If you have multiple people on your project, make sure that you pull whatever branch that you base your branch off of. Pull that often so that you're staying in sync. And if you have multiple people working on your current branch, make sure you pull often so your code is staying in sync. Take advantage of the continuous integration and continuous deployment automation. When that automation happens, you're no longer waiting for your machine to build. You're letting Azure handle that while you can continue working on whatever it is that you want to do in order to stay productive and not be held up by a build. Now, as this talk has a limited amount of time, I wanted to make sure you have some resources to help you move along in doing React and JavaScript in Azure with Azure DevOps. So there's the Azure DevOps YouTube site. Their developer community site is well for asking about features, getting support. Their services documentation has been great for finding more about what's going on. The Azure DevOps demo generator, so if you need to make a case for Azure DevOps to your team at work, but you don't want to create a demo, the Azure DevOps demo generator is a full-fledged demo, including work items, including fake commits, all sorts of things. So it's great for standing stuff up like that. If you want to use JavaScript for your Azure DevOps, I've included a couple links on how you can build, test, and deploy, both with the YAML, and the other one might include the classic pipeline. What you saw in this demo is the classic pipeline. For those who are not familiar with Git, I include a few links on how you can learn more about Git and get comfortable with your Git skills. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ping me on Twitter. I am @Saduki, or I'm also available on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Saduki. Wishing you a lot of success in your JavaScript adventures with Azure DevOps. Thank you.